Hey Dave, Steve Dondershine here. This is my final presentation on St. Clair's defeat, November 7th, 1791. And this is a study in battlefield archaeology. I've subtitled the presentation From Mutual Tragedy to Restorative Collaboration. And I think that actually captures something about this battle. It was a decisive victory for the Native American Confederation against the US Army, but it ended up in the long run being the catalyst for a lot of bad things happening. So eventually it was defeat. The good news is that the context of this particular project, um, there was a collaboration that I think was restorative in many ways to tribal culture and also just to the public good. The battle was defeat specifically for General Arthur St. Clair. And sort of in the aftermath, he was pilloried in the local newspapers as quote unquote the hero of the Wabash. You can see in this little clipping I have down in the bottom right hand side, obviously meant to be satirical. So, a little background about the project. So this was conducted by the Ball State Applied Anthropology Laboratory. This is a university in Indiana, and the lead archaeologist was Christine Thompson, and her co-principal was Dr. Kevin Nolan. And this project started way back in 2010 and has gone up and through 2023. And it's really a re-examination of the battlefield in and of itself, with a new focus on the Native perspective and Native tactics during the battle. And coming out of the project, I would say the team really improved some of the interpretive materials that were being offered at the fort, which is the site of the battlefield, and some really fantastic digital tours and products as well that I'll tell you a little bit about. And they also, for a while, had a traveling exhibit called St. Clair's Defeat Revisited, a new view of the conflict that was funded by a National Endowment for the Humanities and NTHP grant. That seems like it was extremely cool, and it's basically the digital version of that exhibit is online now. So the team really was not very intensive in terms of their collaboration with tribal peoples until around 2017. I mean, they were kind of going through the motions and doing all of the required stuff. And then, according to Christine Thompson, they kind of realized that they wanted to raise the bar, and they really wanted to go in depth and strike some new ground with in terms of their collaboration. And it's what they call it community engaged scholarship, but it's basically what we've been calling collaborative archaeology in this class. And so in 2017, they went to an engagement scholarship consortium where they networked with tribal representatives. And then they went to an Ohio Tribal Nations conference where they did more of the same. And they communicated with, I think, 39 different tribes. And eventually they ended up finding 11 TIPOs from those tribes that were really interested in participating. And then it became a true collaborative exercise, mostly in terms of creating this exhibit that we're talking about. And it was actually written into the proposals funding the grant proposals funding the exhibit. And there was back and forth with archaeological reporting between the TIPOs and the archaeologists, reviews of findings. And then when it came to actually doing the creation of the documentation and the editing, it was really collaborative. They would meet as a group. They'd have conferences, and it seems like the TIPOs were very, very exacting and precise, and they really went through a laborious but satisfying process to come out with the final documents. The battle itself, you can see this quote here from Glenna Wallace, who's the Eastern Shawnee chief. She says, the greatest defeat the Native Americans won, but the United States did not want to acknowledge the tremendous Native victory, which is absolutely true. I think it was something that they couldn't fathom, let alone admit to. So the backdrop for this battle is the Northwest Indian War, which occurred from 1786 to 1795. It really started at the end of the Revolutionary War with the 1783 Treaty of Paris, wherein the British ceded control of the Northwest Territory. And it being the end of the war, the kind of fledgling US government was really, really deeply in debt. And they wanted to sell land in order to pay that debt. And they saw this territory as being, uncivilized and sort of given the attitude of manifest destiny. They sent settlers, they sold land and sent settlers into the region. Of course, the native tribes were not happy about this, and they attacked riverboats coming up the Ohio River and attacked the settlers. And eventually, in 1790, President Washington got fed up, and he sent General Arthur St. Clair on an expedition to build forts along the Ohio River, but primarily to attack the Delaware village of, let's see if I can say this, Kehikayonki, which is current Fort Wayne, Indiana, which was a pretty large village that I think the military considered to be sort of the base of operations for the tribes that were giving them so much trouble. The two standout commanders on the Army side were St. Clair himself and his underling, Major General Richard Butler. And I'm sure there were many Native American commanders given the Confederation of Tribes, but some of the more famous standout commanders were Little Turtle, who was a Miami chief, the Shawnee chief Blue Jacket, Bacongahelis of the Delaware, and then an interesting character named Simon Girty, who was actually a Mungo captive. Um, and he'd been in the Revolutionary War, but had gone over to the British side and ended up after the war and during the war kind of leading raids. And he was known to the colonials as the most hated man on the Ohio frontier. So the battle itself was pretty decisive. St. Clair's force was composed of 1,400 men, and this was a mixture of U.S. Army regulars, levies, and Kentucky militia, who were sort of like frontiersmen. The militiamen were armed with actual rifles, which had a better range than the muskets that the regular army guys used. And they also brought along 250 camp followers with them, which I think says something about what their attitude was. I don't think they were expecting there to be much of a brawl, given that they brought 250, women and children and civilians with them. The Indian force was primarily composed of the largest components were the Miami, the Delaware, and the Shawnee, but you'll see on a later graphic all the tribes involved. And they think it was probably about 1,400 warriors, although estimates range between 500 and 2,000. Difficult to know this sort of thing. And the Indians had scouted the enemy as they approached this expedition as it was coming towards the village. So they knew where they were coming and how many there were. And they decided to confront them on November 3rd on the banks of the Wabash River. And this was really, really a resounding defeat for the U.S. military. You can see some of the metrics down here, but I love this graphic that the Ball State archaeologist came up with. It shows you a comparison of the casualties on both sides between this battle, St. Clair's defeat, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which is sort of the other very famous U.S. Army defeat of this period in history. Well, it's actually a later period in history, but another one of the most famous battles. And you can see the dramatic difference in both native casualties and U.S. military casualties between St. Clair's defeat. And although it's a battle less advertised than Little Bighorn, it's actually even more of a victory for the native force. So these graphics do a good job of sort of showing what happened. The graphic on the left is from a historical document. It was drawn by Major Ebenezer Denny, who was a survivor from the defeat, and it shows kind of the landscape and the configuration of the encampment. You can see that St. Clair kind of created this defensive rectangle on one side of the river, and these are actually flip-flopped. So you can see in the left graphic on the right-hand side, there is a bar representing the militia. And apparently St. Clair had the militia on the other side because he didn't think there was room for them. And so they were very exposed on the other side of the river. And then you can see kind of a more cogent graphic done by Ball State on the right. And you can see that the native force, they arranged themselves in a crescent around the encampment. And this was a tactic that they had used before. I mean, it was like a known tactic. It's not something that they invented this battle. But the difference here is that it was huge. You can see that in addition to the central force, the Ottawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi on one side and the Wyandot, Seneca, and Cherokee were on the other side. Um, Christine Thompson estimated that this probably three quarters to a mile in length, which is huge and very difficult to coordinate when you've got so many combatants. And also that the Native American force that they were taking advantage of a high ridge that went along this crescent to conceal themselves. And so the way the battle unfolded was that the central Miami force came down on the militia who were exposed. They were grossly outnumbered, surprised. It was like 6:30 in the morning. They weren't ready for it. And they panicked across the river into the main encampment, which caused even more chaos. And then, kind of like a pincher movement, the two flanking tribes converged. And after about 3 hours, the army forces were totally devastated, and the remaining forces, the remaining combatants, hightailed it for 30 miles back to Fort Jefferson. In terms of the archaeology, I think that the archaeologists would say that what they came out of this with was a more nuanced interpretation of the battle. Um, the research really focused on landscape analysis and looking at the terrain. And so the first thing that they did is they went out with metal detectors to see if they could determine where this actual crescent was on the battlefield. And they found some stuff. They found lead balls, they found belt buckles, they found pieces of muskets and that sort of thing. And then they used like GIS mapping systems to kind of create models of where they thought the crescent was. They also did visibility studies where they looked at the landscape. And I don't, apparently, there's a technique that can be used to do this kind of survey where you can determine sight lines. And I guess it's something that's also done in the U.S. military when they're looking at potential battlefields. And so they came up with some interesting results. And I think that they were better able, once they looked at their findings, to tell a story that included the Native American side of the battle. One of the taglines, uh, Christine Thompson said that they used on a lot of their interpretive materials is the battlefield is bigger than you think. So it's not just Fort Recovery, which is the fort that's on the battlefield site right now, but it's like this whole landscape with so much going on. Um, and they put way signs out on the battlefield so you could walk a trail and see some interpretation about what happened where. And then they also did this story map digital tour, and there's a little clipping of this over on the right, which is what you'd see on your phone. Um, that basically is like a guided tour of the site. So this is a great graphic. This shows basically kind of sight lines depending on your perspective. And the quote here is that from the high ridge, the Indian sight line was almost like a spotlight down on St. Clair's encampment. So you can see over on the left, this is a graphic that shows you what the Indian force could see, right? And so the blacked out area is what they couldn't see that well, and the clear area is what they had visibility on. And you can see the encampment itself, this little blue rectangle right behind the river is kind of like really a clear target for them. And then on the flip side, it's showing you what the U.S. Army could see, and you can see that most of the Native American force was hidden up on this ridgeline. So I think this is to me is kind of the most interesting part of the research, because it really drives home what they discovered. In terms of the legacy of the battle, as I mentioned before, it was supposedly a victory for the Native Americans, but it didn't really turn out to be a long-term victory. It really only delayed settlement patterns in the Northwest Territory. The U.S. never, at least for generations, it changed the diplomatic posture of the United States towards Native American tribes. St. Clair himself was discharged from the military. He did survive, actually, ironically. But he was made the governor of the Northwest Territory, so I don't think that Washington could have been that upset with him. And they had an inquiry to figure out why this had happened. And of course, what they said is, well, it was snowing, the weather was bad, the troops were poorly trained, they weren't well supplied, and anything but the kind of the actual superior tactics and strategy and ingenuity of the Native American force. And eventually, so the campaign continued. Washington found another general named Anthony Wayne who sort of retrofitted the army, and a couple more battles happened that finalized in the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and the Native Americans lost the campaign. And at the Treaty of Greenville, which was actually signed by Little Turtle, who was the one of the prominent commanders of St. Clair's defeat, the Native Americans, they basically all ceded their lands and ended up being expelled to the various territories, mostly Oklahoma, but kind of all over the Northwest. And we know what happened after that, right? The reservation system eventually led to the boarding schools. And one comment that I thought was really interesting from Diane Hunter, who was the TIPO from the traveling exhibit, is she said, archaeologists came to us and they would ask us about these battles, and we would say we really don't know that much about them. I mean, there'd be a few people here and there that had some stories, but it was because she said that the chains of storytelling had been broken. And that was because of the boarding school system and the erasure of identity that happened there and the loss of culture, so that they oftentimes didn't have stories about these things because they had been lost and erased in the boarding schools. The exhibit itself, I mean, I haven't actually seen it, but it's the electronic version is wonderful, and the video, which there's a clip of, the image down on the right, has a clip of it. You can take a look if you want. Is quite good. It's a reinterpretation of the battlefield, titled St. Clair's Defeat Revisited: A New View of the Conflict. It was broken into four themes: background, battle, aftermath, and persistence. I think persistence was probably the most interesting part in terms of, for me, and in terms of relation to this class, because it talked about the effects on the present day tribes. I think that this was beneficial for them in many ways to do this project. Um, but I think it's useful for people to know about the fact that they were there and that they were a part of this battle, and this was actually a Native American victory. And one of the goals of the exhibit, and I have a quote down here, was, after viewing this exhibit, you will have a new understanding of American Indian nations today as living cultures and peoples, and an interest in the persistence of their culture, language, and social identity. And I think that the exhibit does a very good job of fostering those values. So what specifically did the community come out, the tribal community, come out of this with? And I think some of it was, it reminded me of the video we saw in the Cherokees, where they were very interested, even though they weren't living um, in the state anymore. I think it was in Georgia, right? But they were interested in the village that on the confluence of those rivers, where their people had a stronghold, um, even though they didn't live there anymore. And I think it's very much the same for these tribes as well. They're interested in learning about their history. They're interested in reconnecting with their ancestral homelands. They're interested in the story of the battle for those homelands and what happened. Um, I think that as I mentioned before in the previous slide, that this project was promoted Native voices. One thing on the digital exhibit they have is there are welcome videos from every single one of the tribes, with a representative talking about their history and how they feel about this project. There are also links that you could click on to go to outside websites that would give you something about the history of each tribe. And like I mentioned, I think there are 39 descendant tribes who are the kind of these splintered tribes that from the original nine that were displaced after this campaign. Um, so there's a lot of people involved. And I think also that this was an exercise in trust building, right, between the archaeologists and the tribes. And it was an opportunity for the tribes themselves to network. Because I don't think, they had this working group of 11 people plus the archaeologists. And I think it was probably an opportunity for them to talk as well, intertribally. And finally, that was something that was this is an opportunity to educate the public. Finally, my works, my works cited list. I'll just go through this very, very quickly. This is in Chicago author date style because that's what I've used before and what I'm comfortable with. And I think you mentioned it was okay for us for the bibliography to use other formats. So the first item is the YouTube video that I mentioned that has the traveling exhibit, well worth watching, more of a focus on the collaboration. The second is the actual digital exhibit, the St. Clair's Defeat Revisited, a New View of the Conflict. The third one, Archaeological and Interpretive Research at St. Clair's Defeat in the Battle for Fort Recovery. This is Dr. Thompson talking to a group of archaeologists and sharing her research, but also sharing her experience with the collaboration and providing some tips to the archaeologists if they want to get started and they want to have a collaboration like this one. I feel like this project starting in 2017 or 2018 is something that I guess was fairly new at the time and groundbreaking. Uh, this last one on this page is basically just a citation for the newspaper clipping I had at the beginning of the presentation. These last two here, the one at the top is basically the actual archaeological report from excavation that they released in 2016, which had some of the technical details. And this last one is, I wanted to read a book on the battle, but I didn't have time to read like a really thick book. So I found this little book from Osprey Publishing. It seemed like kind of a more of a popular culture oriented sort of a book, but it was useful. It had some stuff. It was published in 2011, so it kind of gave me a view also of what they were talking about with kind of the old perspective on the battle, because it really was more about the explanation for the loss was more about the ill preparedness of the United States Army. And it had some really nice illustrations in it, but otherwise it was kind of an interesting foil to what I had read in the actual project itself. Anyway, Dave, thank you so much. I had a wonderful experience this semester. I'm enrolling in your Native American survey class in the fall. I look forward to maybe talking to you. I'm hoping I've been meaning to kind of you know, call you up and chat a little bit with you, but I've been working during the day and had trouble finding the time. So I'm going to try and make that a priority for us maybe to sit down and chat and just say hello um, in the fall. Anyway, thank you much for your time, and I will see you next semester. Have a good summer.